At my husband's funeral, his business partner handed me an envelope proving my own children wanted to erase me. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. I promise that this will be the best story you will hear in your life. For 35 years, Eleanor Whitman had perfected the art of invisibility. She was the quintessential corporate wife, elegant, discreet, and unfailingly supportive. Her life revolved around creating the perfect backdrop for her husband Richard's success. She planned charity galas with military precision, maintained their sprawling Connecticut estate, and raised 3 children who were meant to embody the Whitman legacy of power and prestige. Now sitting beside Richard's hospital bed, watching machines breathe for him after his sudden collapse, Eleanor felt strangely untethered. The doctors had used words like prolonged coma and uncertain prognosis, creating a limbo where she was neither wife nor widow. Just 3 days ago, they had been hosting the annual Whitman Industries charity dinner. Richard had seemed fine, commanding the room as always, his silver hair and tailored suit projecting the image of infallible strength that had built their family's reputation. "Mrs. Whitman?" A nurse appeared at the doorway. "There's someone here to see you." Eleanor smoothed her silk blouse and straightened her shoulders, habits ingrained from decades of public appearances. "Thank you. I'll be right out." In the sterile corridor stood Martin Cooper, Richard's business partner of 30 years. His normally confident posture seemed diminished, his eyes avoiding hers as he clutched a manila envelope. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry about Richard," he began, his voice carrying the weight of something beyond sympathy. "The doctors are hopeful," she replied automatically. The phrase she'd been repeating to everyone, a script she followed without conviction. "I need to speak with you privately," Martin said, glancing nervously at the nursing station. Not here. They found a small waiting room at the end of the corridor. Eleanor perched on the edge of a vinyl chair, maintaining the perfect posture that had become second nature after countless corporate dinners. Martin sat heavily across from her. "What I'm about to tell you, what I'm about to give you, I should have done years ago." He extended the envelope with trembling hands. "Richard made me promise never to reveal this, but with his condition, and what I've discovered the children are planning, I can't remain silent any longer." Eleanor took the envelope, her manicured fingers tracing its sealed edge. "What is this, Martin?" "Evidence, documents, things that Richard kept hidden even from you, especially from you." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Eleanor, Michael, and Victoria are making moves to push you out completely. They've been meeting with the board behind your back. They're preparing to challenge your proxy rights while Richard is incapacitated, claiming you're emotionally unstable and unfit to make decisions." The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too harsh. "That's absurd. I'm their mother. This isn't about family. It's about control of Whitman Industries. The company is worth billions, and with Richard incapacitated, there's a power vacuum." Martin gestured to the envelope. "Inside you'll find proof of what they're planning, along with access codes to Richard's private server and safety deposit boxes. There's also documentation of irregularities within the company that even I wasn't fully aware of until recently." Eleanor's world, already tilted by Richard's collapse, seemed to shift further on its axis. "Why would my children do this?" "Because Richard taught them that power matters above all else. They were raised watching him make strategic decisions that often left casualties in their wake. Not physical harm," Martin clarified quickly, "but careers destroyed, families financially ruined. Richard believed that business was war by other means, and he raised Michael and Victoria in that image." "And Thomas?" she asked, thinking of her youngest son, always the most sensitive of the 3. "Thomas is being manipulated by his siblings. They're using his name on documents I don't think he fully understands." Martin checked his watch. "I need to go. Michael has called an emergency executive meeting for tomorrow morning. They're moving quickly, Eleanor." After Martin left, Eleanor sat alone in the waiting room, the envelope heavy in her lap. For decades, she had been the perfect corporate wife, silent, supportive, unquestioning. She had believed in the myth of her family's perfect unity, had willingly stepped back from her own ambitions to nurture Richard's vision. Even when she'd had doubts about certain business decisions, she'd suppressed them, trusting that Richard knew best. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope. Inside were financial records, email printouts, meeting minutes, and legal documents. As she read, the careful architecture of her life began to crumble. There were records of offshore accounts she'd never known about, transcripts of board meetings where Michael and Victoria had begun positioning themselves against her interests months ago, and a draft of a legal petition to have her declared emotionally unfit to exercise proxy control in Richard's absence. Most shocking was a psychological profile her children had commissioned on her, highlighting her dependent personality and inability to function independently of her husband, traits they planned to use against her in court. They had been monitoring her activities, noting her anxiety medication prescribed after a minor car accident last year, gathering ammunition. Her hand shook as she read an email from Victoria to Michael. "Once Dad's situation stabilizes, we need to move quickly with Mom. She's always been decorative, not functional. The company can't afford her sentimentality. The plan remains, you take CEO, I take CFO, and we keep Thomas visible for PR purposes. Mom gets the foundation to play with. It keeps her occupied and out of operations." Eleanor felt a surge of emotion, not just betrayal, but something deeper, shame. Shame at how thoroughly she had surrendered her own identity, how completely she had bought into the narrative of being decorative, not functional. She had willingly participated in her own diminishment, believing it was her role, her duty. She continued reading until she reached a handwritten note from Martin. "Eleanor, there's more in the private server. Access code Eleanor 1982, the year they had met." Below that he'd written an address in the city and a key code. Just then her phone vibrated. A text from Victoria. "At the hospital. Where are you? Family meeting about Dad in the conference room." Eleanor quickly returned to Richard's room to collect her purse. As she stood at his bedside, looking down at his still form, she felt a strange sense of clarity emerging through the shock. For 3 decades, she had lived as Richard's shadow. Now, with him silenced, she would need to find her own voice. In the elevator, she straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. She would face her children, but not as the mother they had dismissed. Something was awakening in Eleanor Whitman, something long dormant but never fully extinguished. The conference room door was closed when she arrived. Through the glass, she could see Michael standing at the head of the table, Richard's position, gesturing emphatically. Victoria sat to his right, elegant and poised, while Thomas slouched in his chair looking uncomfortable. Eleanor paused, tucking the envelope into her purse. For a moment, she considered confronting them immediately with what she'd discovered. But a new instinct, one she barely recognized as her own, whispered caution. Knowledge was power, and for the first time in decades, she possessed knowledge that others didn't know she had. She would listen first. Observe. The woman who entered that conference room might look like the Eleanor Whitman they had always known, perfectly coiffed, unfailingly polite, but beneath the familiar exterior, something fundamental had changed. As she pushed open the door, 3 heads turned toward her. The conversation halted abruptly. "Mother," Michael said, recovering quickly, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We were just discussing how to handle the company announcements regarding Father's condition." Eleanor took a seat opposite Victoria, noting how her daughter's gaze flicked briefly to the purse where she had stowed the envelope. "I'm sorry I'm late," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the storm within. "Please continue. I'm very interested in what you have planned." The next morning, Eleanor woke before dawn, her mind racing despite the sleeping pill she'd taken. The family meeting had been a masterclass in manipulation, Michael and Victoria presenting a united front, talking over her suggestions, using corporate jargon to exclude her from the conversation. Thomas had remained mostly silent, occasionally giving her sympathetic glances, but never contradicting his siblings. They had already drafted a press release about Richard's condition, positioned Michael as interim CEO, and scheduled board meetings without consulting her. When she'd questioned these decisions, Victoria had patted her hand condescendingly. "Mom, you don't need to worry about all this. It would only stress you unnecessarily. You should focus on Dad and yourself right now." The subtext was clear: stay in your lane. Be decorative, not functional. Eleanor slipped out of bed and dressed in the dark, choosing a simple black pantsuit instead of her usual colorful attire. Today she needed armor, not adornment. According to Martin's note, the address he'd provided was for a private bank where Richard kept a safety deposit box unknown to the rest of the family. Downtown was just coming alive when her car pulled up to the discreet building. The bank manager, recognizing her name if not her face, escorted her to a private room after verifying the credentials Martin had provided. "Mrs. Whitman, no one has accessed this box in over 3 years," he informed her before leaving her alone with the metal container. Inside, she found more documents, old contracts, photographs, USB drives, and a leather-bound journal with Richard's monogram. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. Her husband had never been one to record his thoughts. He considered it a liability. The journal's first entry was dated 20 years earlier, secured Cooper's partnership through leverage. His daughter's indiscretion provides perfect pressure point. Eleanor suspects nothing. Better this way. Eleanor's stomach clenched. Martin's daughter had suffered a public scandal 2 decades ago, a scandal that had nearly destroyed her career before it began. Eleanor had always believed it was unfortunate timing. Now she understood it had been orchestrated by her husband. Entry after entry revealed a Richard Whitman she had never known, calculating, manipulative, willing to exploit any weakness. He wrote about teaching Michael and Victoria his methods, preparing them to continue the Whitman way while lamenting Thomas's disappointing softness. There were mentions of questionable business practices, not illegal, but certainly unethical. Competitors systematically undermined, environmental regulations circumvented through legal loopholes, employees strategically terminated before pension benefits matured. Most disturbing were his observations about her. Eleanor remains ideally oblivious. Her social connections continue to provide useful business intelligence, though she has no idea how valuable her charity work is to our corporate strategy. Her naivety is her most charming quality. Tears blurred her vision. Had their entire marriage been strategic? Had she been nothing more than another asset in his portfolio? As she continued reading, her phone buzzed incessantly, Michael and Victoria demanding to know where she was. The board meeting was starting soon. She silenced the device and focused on the journal, looking for anything that might help her understand the full scope of what she was facing. The final pages contained Richard's contingency plans, including instructions for sidelining her if anything happened to him. "Eleanor must be handled carefully," he'd written. "Her name carries weight in certain circles. The Foundation provides perfect containment. It satisfies her do-gooder instincts while keeping her away from actual operations." Eleanor closed the journal, a cold clarity replacing her initial shock. She had been systematically diminished, not just by Richard, but with her own complicity. She had accepted the ornamental role, had believed the narrative that she wasn't suited for business decisions, had surrendered her voice so completely that her own children saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. At the bank's computer terminal, she accessed Richard's private server using the code Martin had provided. There she found even more damning evidence. Emails between Richard and the children discussing how to manage Mother in various scenarios, financial statements showing the true value of holdings kept hidden from her, recordings of board meetings where her input had been systematically undermined. By the time Eleanor left the bank, the board meeting would be well underway. Instead of rushing to attend, she directed her driver to take her to the Whitman Industries legal department, located in a separate building from the main corporate offices. Lawrence Jameson, the company's chief counsel and Richard's longtime friend, looked up in surprise when she was shown into his office. "Eleanor, I thought you'd be at the board meeting. Michael said you weren't feeling up to it. Did he?" Eleanor sat down across from him, setting her purse carefully on the floor beside her. "Lawrence, how long have you known my family?" The attorney removed his glasses, seemingly confused by the question. "Well, Richard and I met in law school, so nearly 40 years. And in that time, have you ever known me to make a significant business decision regarding Whitman Industries?" He hesitated. "Your expertise has always been more in the philanthropic arena." "That wasn't my question." Eleanor's voice remained gentle, but there was new steel beneath it. "Have I ever been given the opportunity to make business decisions?" Lawrence shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor, what's this about?" She reached into her purse and removed a single document, Richard's healthcare proxy, naming her as his decision-maker in medical matters. "This is legal and binding, correct?" "Of course. And similarly, in Richard's absence, as his wife and the second-largest shareholder, I have voting rights on the board." Lawrence nodded slowly. "Yes, though there are certain provisions that could be challenged if I were declared mentally incompetent," Eleanor interrupted, watching his face carefully. The lawyer's expression confirmed her suspicions before he could compose himself. "Has someone suggested such a thing? That would be outrageous." Eleanor placed the psychological assessment her children had commissioned on his desk. "This would be the foundation for such a case, I believe." Lawrence scanned the document, his face draining of color. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter? What matters is that my children are conspiring to remove me from any position of authority while Richard is incapacitated. And I need to know, Lawrence, are you with them or will you honor your ethical obligations to all shareholders, including me?" The attorney stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "I had no knowledge of this specific document, though Michael did inquire about incapacity provisions in general terms." He hesitated. "Eleanor, there's something you should know. Richard made changes to his will and the company trust structure 6 months ago. Changes that aren't entirely favorable to your position." "Show me," she said simply. For the next hour, Lawrence walked her through the complicated legal maneuvers Richard had implemented, structures designed to minimize her control while maximizing the children's authority in case of his incapacitation or death. "It's not completely airtight," Lawrence explained, pointing to specific clauses. "There are vulnerabilities, particularly regarding the Foundation's relationship to the parent company and the international subsidiaries." Eleanor listened carefully, taking notes, asking pointed questions that clearly surprised the attorney. When they finished, she stood and gathered the documents. "I'd like copies of everything, please. And, Lawrence, I expect complete confidentiality regarding this meeting." He hesitated. "Eleanor, Michael is technically my boss now as interim CEO, and I am Richard's proxy and a major shareholder. More importantly," she added, holding his gaze, "I know about the Harrison settlement that was kept off the books. I know about the Westlake property holdings under shell companies. I know many things that would be very uncomfortable if they came to light." Lawrence's surprise was evident. "How did you—" "I've been the perfect corporate wife for 35 years, Lawrence. I've been in every room, heard every conversation, been treated like furniture while men spoke freely around me. Did you really think I wasn't listening?" It was a bluff. She had only just learned about these matters from Richard's private files, but Lawrence couldn't know that. He nodded slowly. "I'll have everything sent to your home this afternoon. And Eleanor, for what it's worth, I always thought Richard underestimated you." As Eleanor left the legal offices, her phone rang again. This time she answered. "Mother, where are you?" Michael's voice carried the impatient tone he reserved for inconvenient underlings. "The board meeting ended an hour ago. We need to discuss the press release." "I'm handling some personal matters," she replied calmly. "I'll meet you at the hospital this evening." "This can't wait. Victoria and I are coming to the house now." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I'll meet you at the hospital at 7. Richard's room." She ended the call before he could argue. Her next stop was the Foundation offices, where she had nominally served as chairwoman for years, though her role had been largely ceremonial. The staff seemed shocked to see her walking through the door unannounced, asking for financial reports and program evaluations. By late afternoon, Eleanor had compiled a more complete picture of the Whitman empire, its visible structures and its shadows. She understood now how the Foundation had been used to burnish the company's image while serving as a tax strategy. She saw how her charitable work, which she had believed was separate from Richard's business interests, had in fact been weaponized for corporate advantage. At her home, she found Lawrence's promised documents waiting. She also found Thomas sitting in the kitchen looking troubled. "Mum," he said, standing awkwardly when she entered, "Michael and Victoria are furious. They went to the hospital already." Eleanor set down her files. "Are you here as their emissary?" Thomas flinched. "No, I'm here because I need to know what's going on. They're saying you're acting erratic, that you're overwhelmed by Dad's situation. And what do you think, Thomas?" Her youngest son looked away. I think everyone's trying to control the narrative. Dad's always said that perception is reality in business. Eleanor studied her son, so clearly uncomfortable with conflict, so desperate for approval. Your father has said many things over the years. Not all of them are true. What does that mean? Instead of answering directly, Eleanor asked, do you know what your role is in your siblings' plans? Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Public relations, the human face of Whitman Industries. And do you know that they've placed your name on documents authorizing financial transactions you haven't been briefed on? That they're using your signature on board resolutions you haven't read? His expression confirmed his ignorance. That's not. They wouldn't. Eleanor opened her briefcase and removed several documents bearing his signature. These were in your father's private files. I suggest you read them carefully before you decide whose side you're on in this family drama. As Thomas began reading, his face paled. I never authorized these transfers. This isn't even my signature. It's close, but it's close enough to pass casual inspection, Eleanor finished for him. Your siblings have been using you, Thomas. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Thomas looked up at his mother, seeing something new in her expression, a strength, a clarity of purpose he'd never noticed before. What are you going to do? Eleanor checked her watch. It was nearly 7. I'm going to the hospital to meet your brother and sister. I suggest you come with me. It's time we all had an honest conversation about the future of this family and this company. As they drove to the hospital in silence, Eleanor reflected on the whirlwind of the past 36 hours. The woman who had entered that hospital room yesterday, decorative, compliant, defined by her husband's success, was already fading away. In her place was emerging someone new, someone who had always existed beneath the careful facade, but had never been permitted to speak. Tonight, she would begin to find her voice. The hospital corridor felt unnaturally quiet as Eleanor and Thomas approached Richard's room. Through the door's narrow window, Eleanor could see Michael pacing while Victoria sat beside their father's bed, her posture perfect, even in this sterile setting. Neither looked up when she entered, Thomas trailing uncertainly behind her. Finally, Michael said, checking his watch with theatrical emphasis, we've been waiting for over an hour. I said 7 o'clock, Eleanor replied calmly, setting her purse on the windowsill. It's exactly 7, Victoria stood, smoothing her skirt. Mother, we need to discuss your behavior today. Skipping the board meeting, visiting legal without authorization. Without authorization? Eleanor interrupted, her voice soft but firm. I wasn't aware I needed permission to speak with company counsel. Michael stepped forward. That's exactly the problem. You don't understand how things work. Lawrence reports to the CEO, which is currently me, not to family members who happen to be shareholders. Eleanor studied her eldest son, so like Richard in his bearing and absolute certainty of his own authority. Let's be clear about something. I am not just a family member who happens to be a shareholder. I am Richard's wife, his healthcare proxy, and the second largest individual shareholder in Whitman Industries. A position that doesn't confer operational authority, Victoria interjected. Mother, we're worried about you. This situation with Dad has clearly affected your emotional stability. Is that why you commissioned a psychological profile on me? Eleanor asked quietly. The siblings exchanged glances, momentarily thrown off balance. That was a standard precautionary measure. Michael recovered quickly. Given Dad's condition, we needed to ensure all key stakeholders were capable of making sound decisions. Key stakeholders, Eleanor repeated. An interesting way to describe your mother. Thomas stepped forward. Did you also need to forge my signature on board resolutions? Was that a standard precautionary measure too? Victoria's eyes narrowed. What have you been telling him? The truth, Eleanor said simply. Something that seems to be in short supply in this family. Michael's demeanor shifted, his corporate polish giving way to harder edges. Mother, you're clearly overwrought. We came here to discuss a unified communication strategy regarding Dad's condition and the company's stability. Instead, you're making wild accusations. Not accusations, facts. Eleanor moved to stand at the foot of Richard's bed, facing her children across his motionless form. Facts documented in your father's private files, in Martin Cooper's records, and in company documents I've spent the day reviewing. Martin had no right, Victoria began, To warn me that my own children were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent? Eleanor finished for her. I disagree. I think he had every moral obligation to do so. The room fell silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of Richard's monitors. Eleanor looked at each of her children in turn. Michael's barely contained fury, Victoria's calculating assessment, Thomas's confusion. I want you to understand something, she continued, her voice gaining strength. I have spent 35 years supporting your father's vision. I surrendered my own ambitions, my own voice, to help build what we have. I did this willingly, believing it was my role. But I was wrong. Mother, Michael started. Eleanor held up her hand. I'm not finished. You were raised to see me as decorative, not functional. Your father encouraged this perspective. But it was a lie, one I participated in to my shame. She reached into her purse and removed a flash drive, holding it up. On this drive is everything I've discovered in the past 36 hours. Offshore accounts your father kept hidden, board manipulations, the true structure of the Westlake Holdings, the Harrison settlement, the environmental compliance workarounds in the Michigan factory. Victoria's composed facade cracked slightly. Where did you get that information? Toisu, from your father. He kept meticulous records. Did you know that? Eleanor placed the drive back in her purse. Multiple copies exist, by the way, in locations you won't easily find. Michael's expression darkened. Are you threatening us? I'm establishing reality, Eleanor corrected. A new reality where I will no longer be sidelined, marginalized, or manipulated by any of you. What exactly do you want? Victoria asked, her analytical mind already calculating new scenarios. Eleanor smiled slightly. I want what I've earned. Respect and a seat at the table. Effective immediately, I will be taking my rightful place on the board. I will have full access to all company information, and the three of you will cease all efforts to undermine my authority while your father is incapacitated. Michael scoffed. And if we refuse? Then I will be forced to share certain information with the SEC, the Environmental Protection Agency, and several very interested journalists. Eleanor's voice remained conversational, as if discussing the weather. Information that would likely result in investigations, fines, and a catastrophic drop in stock value. Is that what you want for your father's legacy? The threat hung in the air. Thomas looked pale, Victoria calculating, and Michael furious. You wouldn't dare, Michael finally said. It would destroy everything Dad built. I would prefer not to, Eleanor acknowledged, which is why I'm offering an alternative. We work together, transparently and honestly, to address the issues within the company, while your father is unable to do so himself. Victoria, ever practical, broke the tense silence. What specifically are you proposing? A restructuring, Eleanor replied. One that maintains the company's stability while correcting its ethical failures. Beginning with a full internal audit of all operations, both domestic and international. That would take months and cost millions, Michael protested. Less costly than federal investigations and shareholder lawsuits, Eleanor countered. Victoria studied her mother with new eyes. You've thought this through. I've had 35 years to observe how power works, Victoria. Did you really think I learned nothing in all that time? The conversation continued for another hour, tense negotiation disguised as family discussion, while Richard lay silent between them, machines breathing for him. By the time they left the hospital, a fragile truce had been established. Michael and Victoria had agreed to Eleanor's immediate inclusion in all board matters, though skepticism radiated from them both. Thomas lingered behind as his siblings departed. Mom, I had no idea about any of this. The signature forgeries, the psychological assessment. I swear. Eleanor touched his cheek gently. I believe you, but ignorance isn't innocence, Thomas. You've allowed yourself to be used because it was easier than standing up to them. He nodded, the truth of her words clearly painful. What happens now? Now we see if your brother and sister honor our agreement. And if they don't, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor executed a carefully orchestrated strategy. She contacted key board members individually, sharing selective information about Richard's private directives and expressing concern about Michael's hasty power consolidation. She didn't accuse or threaten. She simply asked questions that planted seeds of doubt. She reached out to long-time employees who had been marginalized under Richard's leadership, particularly women who had hit glass ceilings within the company. Over lunches and coffee meetings, she listened to their experiences, acknowledged their value, and quietly built a network of allies throughout the organization. Lawrence Jameson proved unexpectedly helpful, providing legal pathways to strengthen her position. "Richard never saw you clearly," he told her during one late-night strategy session. "None of us did." Most surprising was Martin Cooper's continued support. Despite pressure from Michael to distance himself from Eleanor, he remained steadfast. "I enabled Richard's worst instincts for decades," he confessed. "This is my chance to finally do the right thing." Not everything went smoothly. Victoria orchestrated a whisper campaign, suggesting Eleanor was acting irrationally due to grief. Michael attempted to limit her access to certain financial records. Both worked to isolate her from key international partners. Eleanor countered each move with calm precision. When denied access to records, she produced copies from Richard's private files. When excluded from meetings, she showed up anyway, armed with shareholder authority that couldn't legally be denied. When whispers about her stability reached board members, she displayed such consistent rationality and business acumen that the rumors backfired on their originators. 3 weeks after Richard's collapse, Eleanor sat in his home office late at night, reviewing documents for the upcoming quarterly meeting. The room still held his presence, leather and sandalwood, authority and certainty. For decades, she had entered this space as a visitor, never staying long, never disturbing his domain. Now she worked at his desk as if it were her own. A soft knock interrupted her concentration. Thomas stood in the doorway looking troubled. "May I come in?" he asked, hesitating at the threshold that had once been his father's exclusive territory. Eleanor gestured to the chair across from her. "What's keeping you up so late?" Thomas sat down, fidgeting with his watch, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. Michael and Victoria had a private meeting today with Harrison Global's executives. Harrison Global, the company involved in the settlement Richard had kept off the books. "Go on." "They excluded me, but Harrison's CFO mentioned it when we ran into each other in the parking garage. He seemed surprised I hadn't attended." Thomas leaned forward. "Mum, I think they're trying to cover tracks before the audit you've commissioned." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised but grateful for the confirmation. "Thank you for telling me. There's more." Thomas hesitated. "They've been meeting with Aunt Susan." This was unexpected. Susan Bradford, Richard's sister, held significant shares but had never taken an active role in the company, preferring to enjoy the dividends while pursuing her artistic interests in Europe. "What's their angle?" Eleanor asked. "They're trying to convince her to align her votes with theirs at the next shareholder meeting. If she does, combined with their own shares and those of the trust, they could potentially outvote me," Eleanor finished, quickly calculating the numbers. Thomas nodded. "Aunt Susan called me today, asking questions about what's happening with the company. She seemed confused about why there's suddenly so much family drama." Eleanor considered this new development. Susan had always been friendly but distant, another woman who had accepted her prescribed role in the Whitman hierarchy without question. "Would you be willing to reach out to her?" Eleanor asked. "Not to counter your siblings' narrative, but to suggest she come see things for herself before making any decisions." Thomas agreed, looking both nervous and resolved. As he stood to leave, he paused. "Mom, can I ask you something? All these years when he was controlling everything, pushing everyone around, why did you stay silent?" The question pierced through Eleanor's carefully constructed composure. Why indeed? Because she had believed it was her role? Because she had been raised to support, not to lead? Because the few times she had voiced concerns, Richard had made her feel foolish and naive? "I believed the story I was told about myself," she finally answered. "That I wasn't built for business, that my strengths lay elsewhere, that supporting your father's vision was my purpose. It's remarkable how completely we can internalize others' definitions of us." "And now?" Thomas asked. Eleanor looked around the office that had been Richard's sanctum. "Now I'm writing a new story." After Thomas left, Eleanor sat back in Richard's chair, her chair now, and contemplated her next moves. Michael and Victoria's attempt to recruit Susan was predictable, but concerning. The quarterly meeting was approaching, and with it, Eleanor's opportunity to cement her position or lose it entirely. She needed to accelerate her strategy. The fragments of information she had released so far had been carefully selected to establish her credibility without causing irreparable damage to the company. But Michael and Victoria's continued resistance might require stronger measures. Eleanor opened her laptop and began composing a series of emails to Lawrence, to Martin, to key board members, and to several long-time employees who had proven themselves allies. By dawn, she had outlined a comprehensive approach for the coming confrontation. As sunlight began filtering through the office windows, Eleanor stood and walked to the large portrait of Richard that dominated the wall, commanding, confident, control personified. For 35 years she had lived in the shadow of that certainty. "You never saw me clearly," she whispered to the image, "but I see myself now." In the growing light of morning, Eleanor Whitman prepared for battle, not with rage or vengeance, but with the steady resolve of a woman who had finally found her voice and would never again be silenced. The Whitman Industries quarterly meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a crisp autumn morning. By 7:30, Eleanor was already in the executive conference room, reviewing her materials one final time. In the 3 days since Thomas had revealed Michael and Victoria's outreach to Susan Bradford, Eleanor had been working methodically to secure her position. Her sister-in-law had arrived from Paris yesterday, accepting Thomas's invitation to see the situation firsthand. Their breakfast meeting that morning had been enlightening for both women. "Richard always portrayed you as decorative," Susan had admitted over coffee. "The perfect hostess, the charitable wife, but not someone to be taken seriously in business matters," Eleanor had finished for her. "It was a convenient narrative for everyone, including me." Now, as executives and board members began filtering into the conference room, Eleanor observed their reactions to her presence at the head of the table, Richard's position. Some nodded respectfully, others seemed confused, a few exchanged knowing glances. Michael arrived last, Victoria at his side, both freezing momentarily at the sight of Eleanor in their father's chair. Thomas entered behind them, taking a seat midway down the table, not aligned with either faction. "Mother," Michael said tightly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about today's agenda and seating arrangements." Eleanor smiled pleasantly. "No misunderstanding. As Richard's proxy and the second-largest individual shareholder, I'm exercising my right to chair this meeting. Please take your seats so we can begin promptly." The power play hung in the air. Board members watched the exchange with barely concealed interest. Michael's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Susan Bradford entered the room. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, taking the empty seat beside Eleanor. "Jet lag is such a nuisance." Her presence beside Eleanor sent a clear message that shifted the room's dynamics instantly. Michael and Victoria exchanged alarmed glances before reluctantly taking seats opposite their aunt. "Let's begin," Eleanor said, calling the meeting to order with a confidence that belied her racing heart. For the first hour, the meeting proceeded according to standard agenda items: quarterly results, market projections, departmental reports. Eleanor directed the flow professionally, demonstrating a grasp of company operations that clearly surprised many board members. When she asked incisive questions about discrepancies in international accounting practices, Michael's attempt to deflect was undermined by her ability to cite specific transactions and regulatory requirements. "I've been reviewing our compliance standards," Eleanor explained smoothly, "and I'm concerned about vulnerabilities in our European subsidiaries." Victoria leaned forward. "Those operations fall under my purview, Mother, and I can assure you they're fully compliant with all relevant regulations. Perhaps we have different definitions of fully compliant," Eleanor replied, sliding folders to each board member. "These documents suggest otherwise." As the board reviewed the evidence of questionable practices Eleanor had compiled, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Michael attempted to dismiss the concerns as technical oversights, while Victoria argued that industry standards allowed for interpretation of regulatory guidelines. Eleanor let them talk, watching as board members' expressions changed from surprise to concern to calculation. When the defensive explanations finally wound down, she spoke again. "Whitman Industries stands at a crossroads," she began, her voice steady. For decades, this company has operated under principles established by my husband. Principles that prioritized growth and profit above all else. Those priorities served us well in many ways, building wealth and market presence, but they also created vulnerabilities that now threaten everything we've built. She gestured to the documents before them. These aren't isolated incidents or technical oversights. They represent a systematic approach to business that treats ethics as optional and regulations as obstacles to be circumvented rather than standards to be upheld. Michael's face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. You're undermining Dad's entire legacy with these accusations. I'm saving your father's legacy, Eleanor corrected him, and possibly saving you and Victoria from eventual criminal charges. The bluntness of this statement sent a ripple through the room. Eleanor continued before anyone could interrupt. I've had extensive discussions with our legal department about potential liabilities. Lawrence, would you please share your assessment? Lawrence Jameson stood, adjusting his glasses nervously. My team has reviewed the documentation Mrs. Whitman provided. Our conclusion is that while most practices fall into grey areas legally, collectively, they create significant exposure to regulatory action, particularly in the EU and California markets. Conservative estimates suggest potential penalties could exceed $300 million if fully prosecuted. The board erupted in concerned murmurs. Eleanor waited for them to quiet before continuing. I am not here to assign blame or revisit past decisions. I am here to propose a path forward that protects this company's future while correcting its course. She outlined her proposal, a comprehensive ethics and compliance overhaul, transparency initiatives, environmental responsibility commitments, and governance reforms that would create checks and balances against future abuses. The plan was detailed, practical, and carefully calibrated to address the company's vulnerabilities without triggering market panic. Implementation would occur in phases, she explained, beginning with internal reforms before any public announcements. This approach minimizes disruption while demonstrating genuine commitment to change. As board members asked questions about specifics, Eleanor responded with the assurance of someone who had studied the issues exhaustively. Michael and Victoria remained uncharacteristically silent, recognizing that direct opposition would now appear self-serving at best, potentially criminal at worst. When the discussion finally exhausted itself, Eleanor called for a vote on her proposal. The result was unanimous approval, not from genuine ethical conviction for most, but from pragmatic self-preservation. Even Michael and Victoria voted in favor, though their expressions remained stony. Thank you all, Eleanor said as the vote concluded. Now we need to address leadership structure during Richard's incapacitation. Here it was, the moment everything had been building toward. Michael straightened, clearly expecting to defend his interim CEO position. Given the scope of changes we've just approved, Eleanor continued, consistency of leadership is essential. Therefore, I am formally nominating Martin Cooper to serve as interim CEO, with oversight from a newly formed executive committee, including myself, Lawrence Jameson and Susan Bradford. The shock on Michael's face was palpable. This is completely unprecedented. Dad specifically groomed me to take over. The board already approved my interim position. Under circumstances that have materially changed, Eleanor replied calmly. The board now has new information about operational vulnerabilities that require experienced leadership to address. Victoria's analytical mind had already processed the implications. You've been planning this for weeks. I've been planning for a future where this company operates ethically and sustainably, Eleanor corrected her. Something that should have been everyone's priority all along. The vote on the leadership change was closer, but with Susan's support and several board members now clearly aligned with Eleanor's vision, the measure passed. Michael stormed out immediately after, Victoria following with cold fury in her eyes. Thomas remained, his expression a mixture of awe and uncertainty. As the meeting adjourned, board members approached Eleanor individually, some offering congratulations, others seeking reassurance about their own positions. She addressed each with the same balanced combination of firmness and graciousness. Susan lingered until they were alone in the conference room. You know they won't forgive this easily, she said, gesturing toward the door Michael and Victoria had exited through. They're Richard's children in more ways than one. I know, Eleanor acknowledged. But this isn't about forgiveness or punishment. It's about transformation of the company and the family. And of you, Susan observed. I hardly recognize the woman I've known for 30 years. Eleanor smiled slightly. She was always here, just waiting for permission to exist. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's transformation of Whitman Industries began in earnest. Martin Cooper stepped into the interim CEO role with a clear mandate for ethical reform. Lawrence Jameson's legal team worked methodically to address compliance issues before regulators discovered them. Susan Bradford took an active interest in governance, providing an additional check on executive power. Michael and Victoria's reactions followed predictable patterns. Michael initially threatened legal action until Lawrence quietly presented him with documentation of his own involvement in questionable practices. After that, he retreated to sullen compliance, watching from the sidelines as his carefully constructed path to power was redesigned around him. Victoria, ever the pragmatist, adapted more quickly. After several weeks of resistance, she approached Eleanor with a proposal to lead the company's new compliance initiative. "You've always understood systems and processes better than anyone," Eleanor told her. "Use that talent to build safeguards instead of exploiting loopholes." Thomas found his own path forward, developing a genuine interest in the Foundation's work. Under Eleanor's mentorship, he began transforming it from a tax strategy into a meaningful force for community investment and education. The most difficult confrontation came 6 weeks after the board meeting, when Richard finally regained consciousness. His recovery would be lengthy, his return to full capacity uncertain. When Eleanor entered his hospital room alone, his eyes registered confusion at her business attire, so different from the carefully coordinated outfits she had always worn when visiting him before. "What's happening at the company?" he asked, his voice weak but his priorities unchanged. Eleanor sat beside him, taking his hand. "Many things have changed, Richard. I've changed." Over the next hour, she outlined the transformations underway, the governance reforms, the compliance overhaul, the leadership restructuring. She watched emotions play across his face, disbelief, anger, betrayal. "You had no right," he finally said. "I built that company. I made it what it is." "Yes, you did," Eleanor acknowledged. "And now I'm ensuring it survives your methods." Richard struggled to sit up. "I'll fight this. Once I'm out of here." "You're welcome to try," Eleanor said gently. "But you should know that the board is fully aligned with the new direction. The preliminary results are already positive. Employee retention is up, regulatory risks are down, and the market has responded favorably to our transparency initiatives." She leaned closer. "More importantly, Richard, our children are learning that success doesn't require ethical compromise. That may be the most valuable legacy you could leave them." His eyes narrowed. "You planned this. All these years you were just waiting—" "No," Eleanor interrupted. "I believed in your vision, in your methods, in the role you assigned me. I accepted being diminished because I thought that's what love meant." She paused. "I was wrong. And now I'm correcting that mistake, for myself, for our children, and yes, even for you." Richard turned away, unable to process this new reality, this transformed woman who had once been so perfectly predictable. Eleanor stood to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "We have much more to discuss about the future." As she walked through the hospital corridor, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace. The path forward wouldn't be easy. Michael and Victoria's resistance would take different forms over time. Richard's recovery would introduce new complications. External challenges would test the company's new ethical framework. But for the first time in decades, Eleanor Whitman was walking her own path, not as someone's wife or mother, not as a decorative accessory to power, but as herself. The woman who had spent a lifetime in shadows had finally stepped into the light. 6 months later, Eleanor stood at the podium during the Whitman Foundation's annual gala. The event had always been her domain, but previously her role had been ceremonial, the elegant hostess introducing her husband, the real power. Tonight she spoke not as Richard Whitman's wife, but as the architect of a transformed organization. "For decades, I believed that power and ethics were opposing forces," she told the assembled guests. "That success required compromise, that strength meant silence in the face of wrong. I accepted diminishment as the price of belonging. She surveyed the room. Richard in a wheelchair near the front, still recovering. Michael absent by choice. Victoria and Thomas seated together, their relationship slowly healing. Susan and Martin at a table with Lawrence, the unexpected alliance that had made everything possible. What I've learned, Eleanor continued, is that true strength comes not from domination but from transformation, not from silencing others but from finding your own voice, not from maintaining facades but from embracing authenticity. She gestured to the young women seated at tables throughout the room, recipients of the Foundation's new leadership scholarships. These women represent our investment in a different kind of future, one where power is measured not by what you control, but by what you create, not by who you silence, but by who you empower. As applause filled the room, Eleanor felt the final pieces of her old self falling away. The woman who had entered that hospital room 6 months ago, the perfect corporate wife, the silent partner, the decorative accessory, was gone forever. In her place stood someone wholly new yet authentically original, Eleanor Whitman, finally and completely herself. Later that evening, as guests departed, Thomas approached her. "Dad asked to speak with you," he said. "He's in the library." Eleanor found Richard gazing out the window, his wheelchair positioned to overlook the gardens she had designed years ago. He didn't turn when she entered. "Impressive speech," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in hospital but still lacking its former commanding tone. "You've become quite the inspirational figure." Eleanor sat across from him. "Is that what you wanted to discuss?" Richard finally looked at her, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. "I built an empire based on certain principles. You've dismantled those principles while keeping the empire intact. That's not something I thought possible." "The principles were flawed, Richard. The empire nearly collapsed under their weight." He nodded slowly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it took someone seeing it differently, seeing me differently, to reveal another path." He hesitated. "I never saw you clearly, did I?" The question, so simple yet so profound, caught Eleanor off guard. In all their conversations since his collapse, Richard had alternated between anger, negotiation, and reluctant acceptance. This was the first time he had approached anything resembling insight. "No," she answered honestly. "You saw what you expected to see, what you wanted to see." "And what did you see when you looked at me?" he asked. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I saw strength and certainty. I saw someone who knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. I envied that, even as I sometimes questioned the methods." Richard absorbed this. "And now? Now I see someone who built something remarkable but incomplete, someone who taught our children ambition without compassion, achievement without ethics." She paused. "Someone who might still have the capacity to evolve if he chooses." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of decades between them. Finally, Richard spoke again. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been." "Neither did I," Eleanor replied, "until I had no choice but to discover the person beyond the role I'd been playing." As she left Richard to his thoughts, Eleanor felt the journey coming full circle. The envelope Martin had handed her at the hospital had contained the seeds of revelation, but the transformation had been her own creation, built choice by choice, decision by decision, voice by voice. The woman who had lived in the shadows had finally stepped into her own light, not as Richard's wife or Michael Victoria, and Thomas's mother, though she remained both, but as Eleanor Whitman, complete and whole, author of her own story at last. Dear listeners, we hope Eleanor's